In the year 757, a city's own soldiers ate the people they swore to protect. 20,000 of them. Every man, woman, and child inside the walls. And here is the part I had to read twice. The men who did it were not monsters. They were heroes, disciplined, loyal, fighting one of the great defensive stands in history. The dynasty they saved didn't punish them for what they did inside those walls. It made them gods. There are temples to them still standing today. So how does a hero end up cooking his own city? Picture one soldier on the wall, lifting a bowl of pale broth to his mouth, weeping while he drinks it. He knows what's in the bowl. That's why he's crying. And it didn't start with hunger. It started with a single piece of paper, a supply order, signed by a man 3 days away who never saw the city he killed. The man who had run that city's logistics was a civilian prefect named Xu Yuan, call him the logistician. And before any of this began, he'd already done the one thing that should have saved everyone. He'd spent months on the unglamorous work that actually wins sieges. He calculated the math, stockpiled grain, and built an emergency reserve sized to feed the garrison and the entire civilian population through a full year of being surrounded. Think of it as a savings account, deliberately overfunded, sitting there for the worst day imaginable. He'd bought the city a year of survival before a single enemy soldier appeared on the horizon. And the city was worth it. Suiyang sat on the Grand Canal, midway between two major cities, and it functioned as the physical cork in the neck of a bottle, and everything south of that cork was the Yangtze Basin, the breadbasket that funded the entire Tang state and virtually the whole war against the rebellion tearing the empire apart. The scholar Han Yu judged it in a line that survived the centuries. Without Suiyang, there is no Tang dynasty. Lose the cork, and the rebels drink the whole bottle. For 2 centuries, this had been one of the safest, richest places a person could stand in the empire. A peaceful valley of mulberry trees and grain fields feeding the imperial capitals, which is exactly the kind of strategic value that history seems to specialize in destroying. Then the directive came. A higher-ranking regional governor, operating from his command post days away, overrode the local authority by memo. He ordered the logistician to liquidate a massive portion of Suiyang's grain and ship it out to 2 nearby commanderies that he judged needed it more. Picture a regional manager emptying one branch's entire emergency fund to cover 2 other branches he's worried about, by email, without visiting any of them, right before the storm. The logistician had no power to refuse. The grain left the city. The savings account drained down to almost nothing. And then, in late January, the rebel army arrived and sealed every road. 130,000 men, under a commander we'll call the rebel general, against a garrison of roughly 7,000. A 19-to-1 disadvantage, behind walls that now held barely any food. The buffer was gone, right when the buffer was the only thing that mattered. That is what tight coupling does to a system. Strip out the redundancy, forbid any slack, and a failure in one node doesn't stay in that node. It detonates down the whole chain. The grain didn't run low because the siege was long. The siege became a catastrophe because the grain was already gone before it started. And here's the part that makes the directive worse. The 2 cities that got Suiyang's grain, both surrendered to the rebels almost immediately, without a fight. The survival reserve that could have fed a city for a year was handed to 2 outposts that folded in days. That's what a bureaucracy does when it optimizes from a distance. It solves the problem on the map and creates the catastrophe on the ground. Now hold that, because here's the part that made the city famous before it made it infamous. The man who took military command was a scholar official named Zhang Xun. Call him the Iron-Toothed Commander, and stay with me, because the name is earned. He stood well over 6 feet, He had a near photographic memory, and in the fury of combat, he ground his teeth so hard they cracked apart in his mouth, and he opened his eyes so wide the lids tore. This was the man facing 19-1. He couldn't win on numbers, so he won on information. And one trick from that campaign is so clean it belongs in a textbook. The problem was simple. In an age before photographs, the iron-toothed commander had no idea what the rebel general looked like. Somewhere in that sea of 130,000 tents was the one man whose death would break the siege, and he was invisible. So the commander built a trap out of human nature. During an assault, he ordered his archers to fire stalks of weeds and tree branches instead of arrows down into the enemy ranks. The rebel soldiers picked up the harmless green shafts, realized the defenders had apparently run out of real arrows, and did exactly what excited soldiers do. They sprinted off to deliver the good news to the boss. The commander stood on the wall and watched where they ran. Every messenger drew a line straight back to one gilded command tent. The enemy had just mapped their own general's coordinates and handed over the location for free. The commander turned to his best marksman, an officer named Nan Ji-yun, the marksman, and pointed. One real arrow this time. It struck the rebel general in the left eye, blinded him, and threw the entire besieging army into screaming chaos. Let that land for a second. He used the enemy's own joy as a targeting system. That's not luck. That's a man reading a crowd of 130,000 people and turning their relief into a map. So the walls held. The deceptions worked. The drums kept the enemy awake at night. The assaults broke against the defense again and again. But here's what brilliant tactics cannot do. They cannot manufacture a single grain of rice. The commander was winning the war on the walls and losing a quieter war inside them, and that second war had a clock that no amount of genius could stop. The food went in stages, and the stages tell you everything. First the war horses, slaughtered and processed. Then the rest of the animals. Then the things that are not food until you're starving. Bark stripped from trees, tea leaves, paper boiled down. The rats, the birds, the leather straps cut from the soldier's own armor and chewed for whatever the body could pull out of them. By the height of summer, all of it was gone. Every conventional source the city had was inside the soldiers already. And the soldiers were still on the walls, and the rebels were still outside. And the imperial protocol that governed all of them forbade surrender under any circumstance whatsoever. And that protocol is the whole machine. Look at the box the commander was standing in. He could not surrender. The law forbade it absolutely. He could not break out. The army outside was 19 times his size. He could not be resupplied. Every road was cut. And he could not let the walls fall, because the walls were the cork, and behind the cork sat the entire surviving economy of the dynasty. 4 walls, no exit, and inside them a few thousand soldiers who needed fuel to keep standing. When you remove every option from a system except one output, the system will start feeding everything it has into that output. The commander had run out of everything to feed his men, except the people his men were there to protect. He started with his own household, and the records preserve the moment with a coldness that's hard to read even now. He brought out his concubine, the woman the histories call Lady Lin, and he told his starving officers that he could not cut his own flesh to feed them, but he would not sit and watch them die while he spared one woman. And then she became the first ration. It was a deliberate piece of theater. By sacrificing his own household first, he made it impossible for any officer to protect theirs. The example wasn't an accident. It was the opening entry in a system.
Picture the garrison kitchen after that. The air is thick and sweet with the smell of cooking, and the smell makes the starving men double over, because their bodies want it and their minds know what it is. there are hardened soldiers standing in a circle holding wooden bowls, and they are weeping, openly, tears running down faces that have seen a year of war. And they are eating anyway, swallowing past the crying, because the alternative is the wall falls tonight and everyone dies, including the South, including the Dynasty. The commander stands over them and does not blink. This is the bowl from the very beginning of this story. Now you know what's in it. What followed was not a frenzy. It was a sequence, ordered by military utility, run like an operation. And the order is the part you don't forget. After the officers' households came the general population of women, judged to have the lowest defensive value. Then the elderly and the young boys, who could not bear arms or do heavy labor. And preserved at the very end, fed the remains of everyone else, were the military-age men who could still stand on the ramparts and hold a weapon. The city's people had been reclassified, no longer citizens to protect, but fuel, sorted by usefulness. That's the cold arithmetic a modern systems analyst would recognize at a glance. When a closed system can't import resources, it begins consuming its own components in reverse order of their value to the one surviving function. The logistician, the same careful administrator who'd stockpiled a year of grain to save these exact people, signed off on the math, agreeing that to abandon the city was to lose the South, and so there was no choice but to hold, whatever holding now required. That's what an institution does to a good man when it leaves him one exit and bolts the rest. It makes the unthinkable look like arithmetic. Right now, in a temple in Taipei, there is a statue of Lady Lin, the concubine, carried in religious processions in her own sacred sedan chair, and by long tradition, her chair is carried at the front of the parade, ahead of the statue of the husband who killed her, so the victim leads her executioner through the streets forever. The city held for 280 days. Then, near the end of November, it didn't. The 400 men still alive were too weak from starvation to lift their weapons. The rebels came over the walls almost unopposed and took the commander and the logistician alive. And what happened next is preserved in the dynastic histories with a clarity that feels almost staged. They drag the commander in chains and force him to his knees in front of the rebel general, who is sitting there with a white silk bandage wrapped over the ruined eye that a stock and arrow trick had cost him months earlier. The general has heard the stories, that this man's fury in battle was so total he ground his own teeth to powder, and he wants to see it for himself. He leans in with a bronze dagger and presses the flat of the blade against the commander's lips, and he says he's heard that in every fight his eyes split open and his teeth crack. He forces the mouth open, and inside there is almost nothing left. 3 teeth, the rest worn down to broken nubs and raw roots, a full year of clenched jaw and silent rage ground into the man's own skull. The commander spits blood into his face and rasps that his only regret is that he didn't live to devour the rebels alive, and that the loss of a few teeth is nothing. They executed him, the marksman, and 34 other officers. The logistician was killed soon after, on the road to the rebel capital. Now consider the number that makes the whole equation either justified or monstrous, depending on where you stand. At least 20,000 civilians went into that city's defense, every single one of them, processed and consumed. A population larger than many medieval European capitals, and by the dynastic records, not one of them survived to walk out the gates. And it worked. 3 days after the city fell. 3 days. A combined Tang and allied army swept back into the region and broke the rebel advance. The cork had held exactly long enough. The southern breadbasket stayed in imperial hands, the counteroffensive had its money, and the Tang dynasty went on to survive a rebellion that, by some counts, cost the empire up to 36 million people before it ended. The 280 days bought the time. The arithmetic that the commander ran in that kitchen turned out to be correct. Which leaves the last contradiction, and it's a clean one. By the strict moral code the commander lived under, protecting your family and your people was the highest duty a man could have, and cannibalism was the lowest sin imaginable. He committed the lowest sin in the service of the highest duty. And the dynasty he saved didn't condemn him for it. It made him a god. There are said to be more than 1,000 shrines to him across southern China and Taiwan today, with something on the order of 7 million active worshippers, and every year crowds carry his statue through streets thick with firecracker smoke and incense. A man who oversaw the consumption of 20,000 of his own people, prayed to, right now, this minute, as a paragon of loyalty. That's what an institution does when it removes every exit but one. It doesn't produce villains exactly. It produces a man who did the math correctly, fed his city to its own walls, saved an empire, and got a temple for it. The buffer that would have saved those 20,000 people was emptied by a memo before the first arrow flew. Everything after that was just the system following the only road it had left.